So as we go into this message, I want to just kind of fill us in where we are, and this is going to help us kind of see where we're going today. It's been kind of an interesting journey because we've had a few weeks where we've had off because of weather and some different things, and it kind of moves some pieces around. And the series was really supposed to go a little bit longer. It was supposed to deal with a bunch of more stories that we found in the Old Testament, but it ended up doing something a little bit different. Dan Lichtenberger and I were talking about this, and I was kind of talking to him through as I was trying to lay some of the pieces out. And what it really turned into was this very interesting series that dealt with the life of Moses on one hand and sort of the people of Israel and their release from captivity in Egypt. So we talked about that for about 3 weeks. So we went first with the story of them in Israel, or in Egypt, in Egypt. And we talked about, how they got there and what their experience was in oppression and under slavery. And then we shifted then as the end of that week and then into the next week, talking about this call that God gives to this man Moses, who was a Hebrew man. He was in Egypt. But what was interesting about him was that even as a Hebrew, he was raised by the Egyptian royal family because his mother had floated him down that river, and he gets seen by the family. And, we're going to take him in, and we're going to raise him, and he becomes a part of the family. He ends up escaping Egypt, though, after a while, and ends up in this mountain region where God speaks to him, and he says, "Look, I need you to go back to Egypt." And Moses says, "I don't want to go back to Egypt. My people there were in oppression, and I kind of sat by and watched all this taking place, and I don't know. I'm not really the person for that. I don't have the. Why are you asking me to do this?" And God looks at him and says, "Because you saw it. Because you saw the oppression of those people. Because you know what it was like. You understand, and you heard their suffering." And he says, "And I saw that in you. I saw the pain that caused you." And then he looks at Moses, and I think this is so powerful. Because he looks at Moses and he says, "I saw that pain that you had." He said, "I also feel that." And he looks at him and he says, "I understand. I feel that pain that you feel. I see that the suffering that you heard from them, I hear that just like you hear it. I see it just like you see it. I understand it like you do." And he says, "So I want to free those people. And Moses, I want you to go, and I want you to do that." And so then we talked about the Exodus story, this incredible, beautiful story of the people experiencing their release from captivity, the incredible moment as the waters part. They walk through on dry land into freedom. And then we talked about that then they get this covenant relationship that takes place. They end up meeting back with God on that same exact mountain as Moses. And they're standing there, and he says, "All right, now, look, you're free. You have been set free from Pharaoh. You're free from slavery. You're free from this idea that you don't have the ability to live your own lives in freedom." He says, now, with that being said, he says, "Now I want you to build a covenant relationship with me." He says, "I'm the God who freed you, and here's what I did for you." And he said, "Now here are the things you are going to do so that other people recognize that you are my people." Now, we talked about real quick that he gives them these 10 commandments that in essence, rather than thinking of them as sort of a pick and choose set of rules and laws, that they are covenant language. They are, I did this for you, you do this for me and each other, and it reveals this covenant relationship that we have. That people look at you and go, "Well, those must be God's people." So they get these 10 commandments and they start to live this out, and they start to, experience their lives as people, and time begins to pass along. And then they get to this really interesting place where after they kind of establish themselves in the promised land, they begin to build a kingdom. They begin to become a people of their own. And then everything starts to change a little bit. They have to figure out, okay, so now that we have our own space, now that we have our own community, now that we have our own kingdom, now that we've, crossed the promised land, we've sort of settled into these different districts and groups and tribes, how do we lead? How do we move forward as a nation? Now, they do something that's really interesting. They develop this system of regional leaders, and this is one of the sermons that we ended up missing. But they end up developing a system of regional leaders that they called judges. Now, the last judge shows up, and his name is Samuel, and the people loved him. They trusted Samuel. He was a good judge. But Samuel's sons were awful and corrupt, taking bribes and perverting justice. So the people, this is pretty normal, right? You look and you say, man, this is a good judge. He's doing good stuff, and he's leading us well, and he's doing all these great things. But I don't want those guys. Those guys are terrible. Look at them. Did you see? He was taking bribes so that, they could get their way, and he's over there doing this thing. And guys, maybe this whole judge thing isn't working out anymore. And the people begin to get together, and you know how this works, right? They're all having conversations saying, well, maybe there's a different way we can do this. Maybe there's something else we could do. Maybe this whole system that we have isn't really working. And somebody says, well, maybe there's a different way. What about the people around us? How are they led? How do they work, and what do their things do? So the elders of Israel come to Samuel, and they bring this request to him, and it absolutely shocks him. You are old, your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like all the other nations. And there's so much going on in this one verse. It's just this mic drop moment if you look at it, right? That he's sitting here, he's doing everything. He's trying to lead the people. He's trying to do what's right. He's trying to help them follow God, love others, be this incredible nation that God is calling you to be. And then the people are like, well, the time has come. It's just not going to be the same. And so you know what? We were looking around at all these other nations. They've got a king that leads them. Why don't we just move to that? That seems like a really good idea. It goes on, it says, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to govern us. Okay, so that ends there. Why? Why did it bother him? Well, it's important to understand exactly what is being asked for here. So to understand that, we have to really look at the context, right? We always want to look at the context of passages, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit because that is crucial to understanding what a text is about. What's being asked here is that in the ancient Near East, kings were not just political leaders, right? It wasn't just that a king was on a throne, writing rules, settling disputes, doing his thing. That's not all that a king was. A king, and we see this all throughout history. This isn't just ancient Near East. This is any kings that we've seen in history. This continues to be the case. Always understand that they have a special relationship to the gods. So throughout the ancient world, the kings then, because of this, were really beyond this idea of simply having laws or just kind of navigating those sort of things. They were everything. The kings embodied this idea of security. So let's think about this for a minute. In many ways in the ancient world, when you thought about your security, you looked around, and where do we get this phrase, right? We say a phrase maybe like, God help us, right? Oh, God help us right now. Well, that's an ask for a divine idea of security. I can't manage this on my own. I can't do this. This isn't going to work out. Who else do I turn to? So the idea was that these kings embodied this security. So because of that, the kings controlled their armies. The kings made treaties. They were like this visible guarantee of a nation's survival. So goes the king, so goes the nation. Where the king leads, the nation follows. The things that the king prioritizes as an important idea, the people are just expected to go along with. And that's why this phrase, like the other nations, is so key here. They say we want a kind of voice to lead others that, we see in the other leaders, oh man, the way that their king talks, he's got so much control and I feel safe. I just want that kind of leader. They wanted the kind of guarantees, and this is a huge one, guarantees that they weren't sure that God could give them. Can you imagine being like, well, I just don't feel like God can guarantee, he doesn't give me the guarantees that, this person can give me. That's their mentality. Normal is I'll just trust people over this incredible God. So then what goes on is, as Samuel gets upset, he begins to pray to God, and he goes, what do I do here? And it says the Lord said to Samuel, this is shocking. Listen to this. Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you. Now, stop, don't read ahead. He's like, all right, we'll go ahead and listen to them. And Samuel goes, what? What? Okay, wait. I think they're crazy, and your answer is, listen to them. He says, yeah, listen to them. For they have not rejected you. He's like, it's not about you. Just listen to them. But they have rejected me from being king over them. So God's like, all right, here's the deal. It's not about you. It's nothing you did wrong. It's not even about his sons. Did you see that? It's not even about his corrupt sons. That's just an excuse. The people want normal. They want to look like all the other nations. They want to have a king like all the other nations. And they say, so we'll do that. And God's answer is, okay, go ahead. Listen to them. Let them do their thing. And then he goes on. Then he says, now then, listen to their voice. And this is the but. I love the big but here. Listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. This is brilliant. What God is saying is, all right, you want to do that? You're about to find out. Now, even though God says this is a huge mistake, and Samuel's going to warn them about it would bring, and here's what he says. This is what he says they're going to get. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. So first, before we go on, he says, all right, God says you guys can have a king. And the people go, yes, God said we can have a king. And they're all cheering. They're like, yes, this is going to be amazing. Who's going to be our first king? And then Samuel goes, and here's how it's going to go. These will be the ways of the king will reign over you. And they're like, all right, tell us what he's going to do. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. Oh. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and equip his chariots. Oh, wait. What is he asking? What's he saying we're going to do? Now he goes on, guys. I'm gonna read ahead. Just keep it here, Tim. I'm just going to tell you some other things. Then he goes on. He says, your daughters, he's going to make them perfumers and cooks and bakers. Well, what if they want to be perfumers and cooks and bakers? Well, he's the king. He's going to do whatever he wants. Well, my kid doesn't want to go run in front of chariots. And he says, well, too bad. That's what he's going to do. Then he goes on. He says, then these kings, they're going to take your vineyards. They're going to take your grain. And then he's going to give those things to the people that like him. Wait, what now? Yeah, he's going to give them to his officers. That's what he's going to do. You're saying the king's going to take bribes from people to be in power, to be in his circle of influence? That's what kings do? Yeah. Samuel says that's what kings do. Does that sound good to you guys? Like, this is like, he goes on, he talks about he'll take your cattle, he'll take your donkeys, he's gonna take all your stuff. And then he says he's also gonna take 1/10 of your flock, and you shall be his slaves. Man, like, the air just completely goes out of the room, right? And if I stood up here and I told you that this is what somebody's gonna do to you and to your children, you would say, well, maybe this is a bad idea. I don't think living under a king sounds like a good plan. Maybe there's a different idea that we can do. Now, here's what's really amazing. Guys, this is shocking. Don't forget that years before this, what were their ancestors? Slaves. They were slaves. They can't even learn from the experience of people came before them. Again, we're going to come back to this later on. But the point is this, that the warning they're receiving was so that they could understand choosing a king meant you're going to be slaves again. And then Samuel drops the mic. He says, and on that day, when that happens, it's going to happen. On that day, you will cry out because of your king. You'll say, what have we done? When you find out, Samuel says, when you mess around with this idea and you find out and it comes back to bite you, he says, you'll cry out. You'll cry out about this king and you'll say, what have we done? Why did we choose this person? And he says, but the Lord will not answer you on that day. Like, that is harsh. Now, I want to pause here because it's so important for us to recognize, again, what moved these people to make this choice. It was all about trust. When they started to look around and their future began to look uncertain, they believed that a king they chose would be more powerful than this God that they were claiming to serve. They looked and said, well, our future looks uncertain, and I guess a king is probably better than this God we serve. And here's the crazy thing about this. We end up seeing this pattern play out over and over and over and over and over again in the scriptures. The people prayed. Good, they prayed. They should do that, right? They made sacrifices. The people gathered for worship. They sang songs. They played guitars. They raised their hands. They sang. They did all the things that you're supposed to do, right? But they stopped short of any actual trust when it actually mattered. And that's why worship gets so screwed up in our minds. We think, like this song that we were just singing, we think that worship is this place of our hands up, right? We think this is what worship is supposed to look like, right? This is worship, right? But how did I get here? Which is why we wrote this song that we talked about, because this song says that I look around at this world, I'm struggling with things that are happening, I wonder if God is here, and then I look at the stories, I look at the songs, I look at my life, and I say, but who am I going to trust? There's only one I can trust, and it's God. They pray, they sacrifice, they worship, but they don't actually trust. The God who saved them of oppression was traded over and over and over again for the oppressors that God had let them out of. And every generation of God's people faces the same temptation to believe that earthly rulers will somehow provide them the security that only God can give. Now, here's where this gets crazy. Eventually, Samuel anoints Saul as Israel's first king, and the people celebrated. And then in every way, after Saul, they got exactly what they asked for. The rest of Israel's history would prove that Samuel was exactly correct. Corrupt kings came in, they led the people into all kinds of idolatry, covenant breaking, and eventually oppressed other people the way that they had been oppressed. And I want you to get this image and this picture. If you're listening to the podcast later, guys, I'll talk to everybody on the podcast. If you're listening to the podcast, I want you to imagine turning your back on God and looking the other way. Because, guys, this is the picture that we need to see that we are all capable of having, just like these people. And it's not just the people, it's their leaders now. Their kings stand up. Their worship leaders stand up. And they go, guys, lift your hands with me. God is great. He's amazing. He's so powerful. But we're going to go over here. And they get led into idolatry, covenant breaking. They don't love God. They don't love others. They end up oppressing people. These are oppressed people who had freedom, and they begin to oppress others. And as they did this, what's crazy about it is they hypocritically continued to come together in worship, which leads us to some of the most prophetic words in the scriptures. Amos 5, it says, God looks at these people and he says, I hate. That is a strong word. I hate. I despise your festivals. Yeah, I hate. And what he's saying is, I despise your gatherings. I despise the things that you that are centered around the calendar. The festivals were centered around a calendar of reliving the freedom story that God had given them. Can you imagine? This is the story. And they're like, we're going to center our lives around God's story, but we're not going to do anything that has anything to do with the actual story. So he looks at it and he says, I hate it. I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. The offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Then he says this, listen, take away from me the noise of your songs. Like, that one hits because, like, as a musician, Lindsay, like as a singer, like Gabe, like you're doing this thing, and you're like, and we all know this, like when you're playing, like we're sitting here playing, and you're like, oh man, this sounds so good. Like you just think it sounds awesome, right? And you're just like, oh, I can just feel this, and the song is amazing. It's so beautiful. And then, like in this moment, God is like, no, it's garbage, absolute trash. Turn it off. Go away. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. Then he goes on in this famous line that we have heard so many times over the last month. But let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We heard those words this last month. The words that were at the center of MLK's speech, the words at the center of civil rights, the words that come out. And the point is, what it's saying is, guys, if you're saying that you're going to follow God, if you're going to do the God stuff, then do it. Then do it. Otherwise, everything you're doing, you've got it in the wrong order. He says you can't worship, you can't sing, you can't praise, you can't say God is good, and then turn around and be people of injustice and be all these other things. He says, no. He says, but let justice roll down like water. Righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Get caught up in the stream of his goodness. Get caught up in his righteousness. Get caught up in justice and come out the other side. Yeah! Like this is the picture. Like he wants it to go the other way. See, we're standing here going, I don't want God's stuff. Like we're pushing back against the water. We're like, I don't want his stuff because I thought this was the good stuff. I don't know about this. And he's like, no, I want you to get caught up in compassion and grace and goodness and mercy. And I want that water to just flow you down the river. And a bunch of people end up on the other side going, whoop, caught up in God's grace and compassion and love. Isn't that cool? He says that's what you're supposed to look like. Stop trying to swim upstream and swim in the goodness of God's grace. It's all right there. The language is clear here. See, eventually what God says in these words is to be my people, reflecting who I am. He says, why should I be your God if you're not going to do that? Now, even after this, guys, God still didn't abandon his people. Instead, he pointed to how he would become their king again. A different kind of God who would rescue them from the mistakes. Listen to this. In Zechariah 9, it goes, rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now, centuries later, after Saul, after everything had gone wrong because of their choice, here's Rome now, occupying the promised land. Israel is once again living under foreign domination. The people are desperate for a king who would overthrow their oppressors. And they started to expect this Messiah, this king who would come and do what Moses did. Lead them out of this oppression, give them a military victory, give them all of their land back. And then Jesus shows up. Just like the way that Zechariah described here, he began to talk about a kingdom, a very different kingdom, which we're going to talk about this next week, and how that teaching was so different than the people thought. See, the people are sitting there going, all right, this king is coming. We're going to get our king. We're finally going to get the right one. If we just have the right king, we just have, that one will fix this. And they look at Jesus and they say, all right, be that kind of king. He says, no, my kingdom looks different than that, guys. Everybody goes, well, wait a minute, we thought you were... He goes, no, that's not my kingdom. Guys, you got to learn this, like God's kingdom is over here. And so their expectations caused them to reject him. Years after that rejection takes place, Jesus ends up on trial. He's arrested. He stands before a guy named Pilate, who is the representative of Rome, the most powerful empire on earth. This guy speaks for and speaks as the king of everything. This expectation comes up again, but this time it comes now on the other side, right? So the people expect a kind of king. Pilate expects a kind of king. And he says to Jesus, well, you're a king, right? Now, this is so huge. So huge. Instead of saying yes, I am. Jesus looks at Pilate, and do you realize what he says? He goes, well, is that what you think? So brilliant. Aren't you a king? He goes, I don't know, what do you think? Is that what you think? Is that what other people told you? Doesn't answer his question. And then Jesus goes on, he says, my kingdom does not belong to this world. Jesus basically says, now, see, you think, he looks at Pilate and he says, you're thinking in the wrong terms. He says, you think this is what kingdom looks like? You think kingdom is the ability to arrest people? You think kingdom is the ability to oppress people? You think ruling others is your ability to control violence, to be in control, to have power? You think that's what being a king is all about? You think being a king is being in charge? He says no. And listen to what he says. He does it. The kingdom I belong to, my kingdom, the kingdom that I'm a part of, he says, the kingdom I belong to and the power that it has looks nothing like what you're doing here. It's not based, and this is such an interesting thing, when he says the world here, when he says it doesn't belong to this world, in the Gospel of John, world over and over and over again means systems. Systems. Economic systems. It means political systems. It means the way that the world seems to operate, the way the world seems to function. He says, my kingdom doesn't function on your value system. My kingdom doesn't function by your rules. My kingdom doesn't function within the systems that you have created. That's not what kingdom is all about. Jesus says the kingdom that I belong to and the kingdom my followers belong to a different type of kingdom. Do you see where this is going? Do you see what's happening here? So let's kind of finish this up and see what's happening. So the early church has to wrestle with this, right? They continue to do so for centuries, just as they continue to do so today. They say, well, how do we exist with this tension? How do we exist with this tension that Jesus says, my kingdom is not within these systems. My kingdom is not within the way that things run. My kingdom is not how this world operates. Well, what do we do with that? Now, one way, this is just one way that the early church wrestled with this, was passages like this that we found towards the end of the New Testament. In a letter that was written to suffering and persecuted Christians, this is what is written for them, how to handle this tension. For the Lord's sake, be subject to every human authority. Whether to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and praise those who do right. And you're like, ew. This sounds normal. That's not very revolutionary. You want me to just say, okay, cool, I'm with the man. That's what you want me to do. Now, here's where this gets wild, guys, and this is my point that I want to make. I wanted to get here, and I wanted to take the time to get here because I want you to see why this is so critical. Throughout history, what happens is people take passages like this, and they try to force modern people to obey and support regimes that we now look at with shameful eyes, right? And they look and they say these passages got used throughout history. Somebody would stand up and say, that doesn't look like Jesus. That's not the way of God. That's that stuff over there. That's not kingdom stuff. And someone would say, well, the passage here says that you're supposed to listen to the authorities. You're supposed to support these kings. You're supposed to, keep your voice quiet. That's what it says. So this was used against abolitionists. I think all of us would look and say, well, I probably would have been on the right side of history. I would have been with the abolitionists, right? And you had pastors coming up, and they would read this passage, and they'd look at all their people, and they would go, for the Lord's sake, be subject to every human authority, even those who say that we should have slavery. That's the end. That's what the word says. They'd move on. This got used against all kinds of people throughout history who were defending slavery, people who were trying to tell people that, hey, this isn't the way the world should work. This is what it should look like. They were resisting injustice. People during the civil rights era had these passages coming out at them and saying, you don't join those marches over there because the Bible says. Remember when I said that context matters? Yeah, we have to do our homework. The context is that this author was writing to people who were facing oppression that they didn't choose. The people that this letter is going to in 1 Peter were powerless and persecuted and trying to survive under an empire that would rather kill them. So what the author was doing is he is giving survival advice to the oppressed, accepting the awful reality of empire rather than challenging it in that moment. He's like, I want you to stay alive. So this is what you need to do. In this moment, this is what you need to do so that the story can keep going. Because if it stops with you, it ends. And the story of Jesus is this is what you're going to do in this moment. Does that make sense? That's what he's telling oppressed people. Now go back with me to 1 Samuel. The people in 1 Samuel had a choice, didn't they? They weren't oppressed. They were choosing to install a system that had the potential to oppress. And that was the very thing that Samuel warned against. When people today who hold the power to choose use Peter's words about survival to silence those resisting injustice, they're not just misreading the context, they're repeating Israel's sin. They're choosing the very same thing that Samuel warned against. One way to put this is there is a significant difference between seeking power that can oppress people and resisting unjust power. Does that make sense? There is a significant difference between saying, that looks pretty good over there, than sitting in the tension and saying, that looks nothing like my God's kingdom. And that needs to change. There is a difference between seeking unjust power and resisting it. See, and only one of those guys, I'm going to say this, only one of those looks like the way of Jesus. And that's what I want to close this. That's why this matters so much. We have, friends, an incredible ability to choose the kind of king that we have, right? And I'm not just talking about politicians. We could apply it there in every choice that we make, but the place we need to apply it before we apply it there is right here. Because that's where it all begins. Every day, you and I are given a choice of the king over our lives that defines how we live, that defines who we trust. And this is the question that those people face, that you and I face today. Will we choose systems of greed, manipulation, and fear? Will we let fear rule our lives? Will we let greed rule our lives? Will we let those things rule our lives? Because that's the kind of kings we then choose. Or will we be people who choose systems of generosity and community and love? That's God's kingdom. And that matters, friends, on this macro scale. It matters on the kind of things that we support in our world. That matters out here, right? It does. But it matters so much in here, in our hearts, Because you and I have to choose. Who am I going to be? And what is my life going to look like? And friends, I just think there are too many Christians who have their back, with their back facing God and what God is all about, hands up, worshiping, absolutely missing the point. And we have to be better. And we have to worship God with all of our hearts because we are in His stream of grace and justice and love. God, we are so thankful for a passage like this that challenges us on every single level, makes us go home and think and process. That God, in this, it is our responsibility from this place to take this and see the story that you have given us and recognize, okay, what do I do? Where are the places in my life that are causing me to look like the people who would rather choose a king? What is within me that is causing me not to trust you and your love and your grace and your mercy? What is it within me that is causing me not to trust the way of Jesus to take all of my life, but just some of it? What is it within me that is causing me to look at this and say, you can have some of my heart, but not all of it? What does it look like to give all? And to recognize your love and your mercy in a world that's in such desperate need. It's your name that we pray. Amen.